The evening sun cast a muted amber glow over the Whitcombe estate, filtering through the tall sash windows of the drawing room and illuminating the delicate embroidery of the curtains. The house, though not ancient, bore the dignified weight of generations of gentry, its polished oak floors reflecting the hurried movements of servants arranging crystal decanters and silver trays in preparation for the anticipated visit of the Duke of Ashford. Lady Eleanor Whitcombe, radiant in a gown of pale rose silk that shimmered with every turn, moved with the poised grace that had earned her the admiration of every house guest and society matron. At 22, her beauty was considered the quintessence of refinement. High cheekbones, dark curling hair pinned perfectly, and eyes that sparkled with both wit and calculated charm. She floated through the room, offering curtsies and carefully measured smiles, each gesture deliberate, each word delivered with the cadence of rehearsed perfection. In contrast, Margaret Whitcombe, 19, lingered at the periphery, her presence barely acknowledged except by the occasional servant who met her quiet gaze with a nod. Her gown was modest, muslin of pale cream, devoid of ornamentation, and her hair was braided plainly, a style that emphasized her bookish demeanor rather than the fleeting fashions of the season. Her hazel eyes, however, held an intelligence that measured every glance, every whisper, every nuance of movement within the room. Margaret had long ago accepted her role as the invisible daughter, relegated to observing her sister's triumphs with a mixture of envy and resignation. Yet tonight, as the household buzzed with expectation, a faint thrill coursed through her, a sense that something, long deferred, might at last stir in her favor. The patriarch, Sir Reginald Whitcombe, a man burdened by debts that the family's estate could scarcely cover, paced near the hearth with thin, restless hands. His powdered wig, now slightly askew from the day's anxieties, betrayed a mind preoccupied with calculations of dowries and alliances. Eleanor's forthcoming match with the Duke represented a vital solution, a chance to restore the family's fortunes and secure the Whitcombe name in society. Margaret, aware of her father's motives, could not escape a pang of unease. She understood that her own prospects were subject to his convenience and the whims of fortune, and yet a secret part of her longed for recognition of qualities that were neither flaunted nor adorned. The arrival of the Duke of Ashford was heralded by the measured clatter of carriage wheels along the gravel drive and the muffled toll of the estate's bell. He was a man of 28 years, tall, with the carriage of a seasoned aristocrat, his posture both commanding and restrained. His dark coat was cut sharply, the tails brushing the backs of polished boots, and his hands, gloved in fine leather, exuded the quiet confidence of inherited authority. Rumors of the Duke's dwindling heirs and the careful management of his ancestral holdings had already reached the Whitcombe household. He was a man respected not only for his wealth, but for the judicious manner in which he balanced duty, estate, and personal discretion. As the footman announced him, the air seemed to shift. A tangible hush fell over the room, the weight of expectation pressing on every figure present. Eleanor's heart quickened as she curtsied before the Duke, her smile practiced yet sincere, designed to charm both man and circumstance. "Your Grace, we are honored by your presence," she intoned, her voice light, polished, yet carrying the warmth deemed appropriate for such encounters. The Duke's gaze lingered briefly on her, acknowledging the surface perfection she offered, and then, almost imperceptibly, shifted toward Margaret, who had instinctively retreated behind the gilded settee. Margaret's pulse quickened, her senses, sharpened by years of observation, caught the flicker of interest in his eyes, an interest not sparked by beauty or social polish, but by something quieter, subtler. As servants discreetly poured sherry and arranged delicate canapes upon silver platters, the room hummed with the low murmur of conversation. The elder guests discussed estate matters, societal engagements, and the gossip of London, while the younger ladies, adorned in satin and lace, cast nervous glances toward the Duke. Eleanor held her place among them, effortlessly engaging in polite discourse, her laughter ringing clear yet measured. Margaret, seated slightly apart with a book whose spine had been softened by constant handling, noticed the glances thrown her way, brief, questioning, and then quickly diverted. She dared not hope for acknowledgement. Still, she could not avert her eyes from the man whose presence seemed to draw the very light of the room toward him. A subtle moment of discord rippled across the polished floor when Margaret, adjusting her seat, inadvertently brushed against a visiting socialite's gown. A porcelain cup teetered and fell, spilling tea across the embroidered carpet. A gasp ran through the room. Eleanor's cheeks colored with embarrassment on her sister's behalf. Margaret froze, expecting censure or ridicule, but the Duke, who had been observing the scene, stepped forward with deliberate calm. "It is of no consequence," he said, his voice low and measured, with an authority that silenced the whispers before they could fully form. There was no condescension in his tone, only a rare acknowledgement of composure in the midst of social misstep. Margaret's breath caught, a quiet thrill passing through her chest, the faintest spark of recognition, unexpected and unsettling in its intensity. Sir Reginald, unaware of the subtle interchange, moved to Eleanor's side, murmuring encouragement, his mind already calculating the advantages of the match he had long planned. Eleanor, sensing the weight of expectation, smiled brightly, her gestures refined, yet she could not help but notice the slight downturn of her father's brow as he observed Margaret. It was a look that conveyed disappointment and calculation simultaneously, a reminder that in their household, practical concerns often outweighed affection or personal preference. Margaret felt the familiar tug of invisibility, a weight she had carried since childhood, yet she also felt a flicker of defiance, a private acknowledgement that her worth need not be measured by embroidered gowns or sparkling conversation alone. The evening progressed, filled with the ritualized dances and polite conversation customary in households of the gentry. Candlelight flickered against gilded mirrors, chandeliers glimmered overhead, and the soft strains of string quartet lent the room an air of elegance that contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of tension. Eleanor was attended by several admirers, her laughter and grace attracting polite, if somewhat calculated, attention. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself drawn toward the piano, fingering the keys with a quiet deliberation, her music soft and reflective, offering a counterpoint to the surface gaiety around her. It was then that the Duke approached, his steps measured, eyes calm but attentive. He paused briefly at her side, inclining his head in acknowledgement of her presence, a gesture unnoticed by most, yet profoundly significant. Margaret looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that instant, a subtle understanding passed between them. There were no grand declarations, no overt flirtations, merely a recognition, quiet and deliberate, of the qualities each held in reserve: steadiness, intelligence, moral discretion, and courage. The room, full of chatter and polished appearances, seemed to fade, leaving a shared space of mutual comprehension. The Duke, aware of the societal expectations pressing upon both families, spoke only enough to acknowledge her talent for music, his voice measured and courteous, yet imbued with an attention that made Margaret's pulse quicken. As the evening drew to a close, with the last guests departing in their carriages and the Whitcombe household left to the quiet afterglow of candlelight, Margaret retreated to the library. She reflected on the fleeting moments of acknowledgement, the subtle gaze, the weight of society's expectations pressing on her family, and the possibility, however faint, that merit and character might yet be recognized above appearance and circumstance. Eleanor, conversely, remained in the drawing room, savoring the compliments and attention that confirmed her position as the favored daughter. Yet neither sister could fully anticipate the subtle currents of interest that the Duke's observant eye had set in motion, a quiet rebellion against convention, a preference for substance over display, and the slow, almost imperceptible spark of connection that would come to shape their lives. The night ended with a gentle hush over the estate, the servants retiring to their quarters, the fire casting long, flickering shadows across polished floors, and the stars beginning to pierce the velvet sky outside. Margaret, alone with her thoughts, allowed herself a cautious hope, the faintest stirrings of courage that perhaps, in a world ruled by appearances, true character might yet be valued. The Duke, back in his carriage, pondered the evening's events with an uncommon introspection, noting the quiet strength of a young woman who, though overlooked by society, had demonstrated both poise and principle under scrutiny. And so, as the Whitcombe estate settled into the night, the stage was set for unspoken admiration, social tension, and a slow, deliberate romance that would challenge convention and awaken hearts in ways neither the family nor society could yet foresee. The Whitcombe estate, having endured the formalities and whispered judgments of the evening, settled into a rhythm of quiet anticipation over the following weeks. The ball had left an indelible mark upon the household, a subtle but persistent reminder of the Duke's attentiveness to Margaret and of the unspoken preferences that society refused to acknowledge openly. Each day brought small, deliberate movements. The careful arrangement of letters, the selection of gowns and gloves, the rustle of silk as Eleanor practiced her smiles before the mirror. Margaret, however, spent her mornings in the library, poring over letters of etiquette, estate management, and literature, her thoughts frequently wandering to the brief moments of acknowledgement exchanged with the Duke. She recognized, with a mix of trepidation and exhilaration, that something unprecedented had taken root, an interest in her mind and character rather than her appearance. On a particularly luminous afternoon, the Duke visited the estate under the guise of discussing the family's holdings and debts, yet his measured attention betrayed motives that went beyond mere administration. Eleanor welcomed him with the full display of charm and sophistication expected of her, the silk of her gown shimmering in the sunlight that spilled through the drawing-room windows. She engaged him with practiced grace, recounting social engagements and the intricacies of London society, her laughter ringing clear and calculated. Margaret, seated in the shadowed corner with a modest fan clasped in her hands, observed quietly, her pulse quickening as the Duke's gaze swept over the room, eventually resting, not on her radiant sister, but upon her own plain features. It was a look that suggested curiosity, and perhaps more unsettling, recognition of something deeper than beauty or social polish. The day's conversation progressed with meticulous civility. Eleanor spoke of dances and charitable initiatives, while Margaret listened, offering the occasional thoughtful observation, careful not to overstep her perceived social boundaries. At one moment, a servant approached with a tray of delicate goblets filled with wine, and Margaret noticed the Duke reaching for a darkened glass, the rim slightly chipped. Instinctively, she rose, her voice low yet urgent. "Do not drink that, Your Grace." A gasp ran through the servants as she spilled the wine, crimson liquid streaking across the polished floor, yet the Duke did not recoil. Instead, he took her hand gently, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and spoke 3 words with deliberate calm. "I trust you." The weight of those words, uttered in such quiet intimacy, sent a thrill through her chest, though the room's murmured shock reminded her that the smallest acts of courage could be viewed as scandalous. Eleanor, affronted by the interruption, faltered in her display of composure, her cheeks tinged with indignation. She could not fathom that her younger, unassuming sister would capture the Duke's attention in such a manner. Margaret, however, felt neither triumph nor shame, only a cautious awareness that the unspoken currents of admiration were shifting. It was in these subtle exchanges that character revealed itself. Eleanor, polished and beautiful, relied upon the approval of others. Margaret, quiet and deliberate, inspired respect through steadiness and discernment. The contrast, though invisible to most, was unmistakable to the observant Duke. In the days that followed, the exchange of letters became an unspoken ritual. Margaret's hand, though unaccustomed to the art of flirtation, conveyed intelligence and sincerity, while the Duke's responses were equally measured, offering insight, questions, and occasional humor. These letters were more than mere correspondence. They were instruments of connection, revealing tastes, principles, and a shared understanding that transcended societal expectation. Margaret read each word with a mix of excitement and caution, aware that a single misstep could invite censure or gossip, yet emboldened by the Duke's consistent recognition of her merit. The household, meanwhile, simmered with its own quiet intrigues. Sir Reginald grew increasingly preoccupied with securing Eleanor's engagement, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the Duke's subtle preference for Margaret. He commissioned his steward to discuss dowries and expectations, his mind occupied with financial calculations rather than the nuances of affection or compatibility. Eleanor, sensing both the stakes and the Duke's measured attention to her sister, oscillated between confidence and irritation, her pride pricked by the quiet revolution of recognition that Margaret's presence seemed to inspire. Margaret, for her part, remained composed, aware of the delicate balance between gratitude, propriety, and personal desire. A discreet afternoon encounter in the estate gardens crystallized the tension between propriety and private inclination. The Duke requested Margaret's presence under the pretext of inspecting the orchard, and she agreed with careful humility. Sunlight filtered through the budding branches, casting mottled shadows across the path as they walked in deliberate silence. He spoke of practical matters, crop yields, estate boundaries, and management of the household. Yet each word, carefully chosen, revealed attention to her judgment and understanding. Margaret responded with observations that were both thoughtful and precise, her knowledge exceeding expectations for her age and social position. The Duke's satisfaction was evident in the quiet, approving glance he bestowed, a silent acknowledgment that her mind and temperament were valued above all superficial measures. The subtle escalation of their connection did not escape society's scrutiny, however. Rumors, first whispered among the staff and later carried to visiting families, began to suggest that the Duke's attentions were less conventional than expected. Eleanor, fully aware of these murmurs, sought to assert her dominance through carefully curated displays of charm and elegance. She wore the latest fashions, dazzled guests with conversation, and sought to monopolize the Duke's attention during visits. Yet Margaret, ever cautious, allowed her worth to be demonstrated quietly, in small gestures of assistance, in measured conversation, in the steadfast composure that came naturally to her. The contrast became increasingly evident, a slow-burning tension that promised both scandal and revelation. One evening, a social visit brought the family to the edge of embarrassment when Eleanor attempted to present herself as the ultimate choice for the Duke. Margaret, seated discreetly in a shadowed corner, overheard the veiled criticisms and the subtle boasts of her elder sister. She felt the familiar sting of invisibility, yet something had changed. The Duke's presence, calm and attentive, lent her an unexpected confidence. His gaze, though polite to all, lingered on her with an acknowledgment that neither flattery nor artifice could command. In that moment, Margaret recognized that the slow, deliberate cultivation of esteem might outweigh the transient displays of beauty that society so revered. Private lessons and casual walks soon became the backdrop for their developing rapport. The Duke, mindful of propriety, engaged Margaret in discourse on literature, philosophy, and the practicalities of estate management. Each conversation revealed depth and discernment, and Margaret, in turn, discovered an unexpected ease in his presence, a sense of safety in which intellect and character were valued above appearances. Small gestures, a hand lightly touching the hem of the sleeve to prevent a fall, a shared look across the garden, a quiet word of encouragement, became laden with meaning. The world outside their shared space remained bound by rigid expectations, yet within these private interludes, the boundaries softened, allowing understanding and admiration to flourish. The days continued to unfold, each marked by quiet discoveries and subtle tests of character. A misplaced letter, a small act of courage, or a moment of composure under observation became points of significance, shaping the narrative of preference and propriety. Margaret, though aware of the potential consequences of attention in a society eager for scandal, began to see that recognition of worth might come from perseverance, intellect, and courage rather than display. The Duke, equally cognizant of his obligations and the societal pressures that constrained him, found in her steadiness a rare promise of partnership, one that might endure beyond the superficial alliances demanded by rank and fortune. As the weeks passed, the Whitcombe household adjusted to this quiet upheaval. Eleanor, though outwardly gracious, carried a growing frustration, unable to reconcile her expectations with the subtle acknowledgment her sister received. Sir Reginald, absorbed in financial and social calculations, remained largely oblivious to the evolving dynamic, while Margaret, mindful of her own restraint, allowed the Duke's esteem to speak for itself. Each glance, each whispered word, each thoughtful gesture became a thread in a slowly woven tapestry of understanding and attraction, a pattern discernible only to those who observed with care and patience. This section of their lives reached a delicate equilibrium as a small incident illuminated the stakes and solidified the emerging connection. A rainstorm forced the family and the Duke into the conservatory, with a scent of wet earth and blooming flowers mingled with the polished wood and soft light of lanterns. Margaret, assisting in arranging fallen blooms, brushed against the Duke as he reached for a fallen leaf. Their hands met for a fleeting moment, a spark of acknowledgement neither could deny. Eleanor, witnessing only the surface propriety, misinterpreted the interaction as trivial, unaware that each small gesture carried the weight of burgeoning respect and affection. By the time evening descended, with the last drops of rain glistening on the estate's manicured gardens, the currents of admiration, propriety, and subtle rebellion had shifted irrevocably. Margaret, quiet and thoughtful, felt a tentative hope stirring within her, a recognition that merit, courage, and character could be seen and valued. The Duke, contemplative and measured, understood that in choosing recognition over appearances, he risked scandal, yet found promise of a partnership both true and enduring. And so, as the lanterns cast long shadows across the polished floors and the family retired to their rooms, the stage was set for whispered rumors, private acknowledgement, and the slow, deliberate evolution of a romance that would challenge convention and awaken hearts in ways neither society nor the family could yet foresee. The dawn arrived over the Whitcombe estate with a muted brilliance, soft lights spilling across the gardens and painting the dew-laden leaves in delicate gold. Margaret, rising before the household stirred, wrapped herself in a shawl of fine wool and stepped quietly onto the terrace. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and flowering shrubs, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe freely, savoring the rare feeling of solitude unmarred by social expectation. Her thoughts, inevitably, turned to the Duke of Ashford. Each meeting, each whispered word, each subtle gesture had accumulated into a weighty awareness that the connection forming between them was unlike anything dictated by etiquette or fortune. She reflected on the stolen glances, the letters exchanged, and the moments of quiet understanding that had begun to define her days. The Duke arrived shortly thereafter, his presence heralded not by the clang of carriage wheels, but by the gentle crunch of boots on gravel, measured and deliberate. He greeted her with the formal nod of a man accustomed to restraint, yet the faint curve of his mouth betrayed a warmth reserved only for her. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, his voice steady yet suffused with an undercurrent of emotion, "I hope you do not mind my intrusion upon your morning contemplations." Margaret inclined her head, returning the smallest hint of a smile, recognizing the weight of propriety in his words while sensing the intimacy they concealed. They walked together along the garden path, sunlight filtering through the branches, illuminating both the flowers and the subtle apprehension in Margaret's expression. The conversation began with ordinary matters, estate boundaries, the upcoming planting season, and the management of the orchards. But beneath the surface lay an unspoken dialogue, an exchange of trust and admiration. The Duke, attentive and deliberate, allowed her to speak with authority, valuing her observations without interruption. Margaret, emboldened by this rare consideration, responded with thoughtful insight, her voice steady and assured, revealing intelligence and practical wisdom that would have gone unnoticed in the grand assemblies of polite society. A gentle rain began to fall, soft at first, then insistent, drumming on the leaves overhead. Rather than seek shelter immediately, they paused beneath the arching branches of a yew, letting the rain mingle with the warmth of shared presence. It was there, in the quiet intimacy of the storm, that the Duke spoke words Margaret had longed to hear, though she dared not anticipate them. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, his tone measured yet imbued with sincerity, "it is not your beauty I seek, nor the accomplishments society so lavishly praises. It is the constancy of your mind, the steadiness of your heart, that compels my regard." Margaret felt her chest constrict with a mixture of relief, wonder, and a tentative hope she had scarcely permitted herself to nurture. As they returned to the estate, each step through the wet gravel brought them closer to the drawing rooms where decorum and observation awaited. Eleanor, who had anticipated that the Duke's attention would remain fixed upon her, found herself unsettled by the subtle shifts she could perceive but not name. Her pride bristled at the quiet acknowledgment given to her sister, yet she could not fault the manner in which Margaret comported herself. Margaret, conscious of the eyes that might watch, maintained her composure, aware that restraint was as vital as courage. It was in these moments, quiet and unassuming, that the true test of character became apparent. How one behaved under scrutiny, how one responded to admiration or challenge, how one balanced propriety with authenticity. The days that followed were marked by both subtle revelation and careful observation. Letters continued to pass between the Duke and Margaret, each word weighed with thought, each sentiment measured with discretion. In his correspondence, the Duke conveyed respect and interest, sometimes lightly teasing, sometimes offering insight into matters of philosophy, literature, and estate management. Margaret's responses were equally deliberate, reflecting her intellect, moral compass, and emerging emotional confidence. This slow, deliberate courtship, conducted under the watchful eyes of society, became a dance of intellect and sentiment, an exchange that transcended the superficialities of beauty and social favor. An incident at a small family gathering soon tested the resolve of all parties. Eleanor, determined to assert her place as the favored daughter, orchestrated a display of charm and social grace intended to captivate the Duke and affirm her position. Margaret, aware of the spectacle, remained composed, attending to subtle duties and conversing with measured attentiveness. The Duke, observing both sisters, demonstrated a quiet discernment, acknowledging Eleanor's elegance without equivocation while subtly validating Margaret's steadiness and intelligence. It was a delicate balance, performed with grace and discretion, yet it marked a turning point. Society's expectations clashed with the reality of genuine admiration, and whispers of scandal began to circulate, thinly veiled as polite conversation. A private evening encounter solidified the emotional stakes. In the estate's library, the fire casting long, flickering shadows upon the polished wood and bookshelves, the Duke and Margaret spoke of future responsibilities, shared values, and the promise of mutual support. The discussion, though conducted in restrained tones, allowed vulnerability to surface. Margaret confessed her fears of societal judgment and familial expectation, her voice quiet yet firm. The Duke, with careful gentleness, assured her that merit and character, not appearances or conformity, would guide his choices. In that space, illuminated by both firelight and trust, their connection deepened, bridging the divide between social convention and personal conviction. Eleanor, though present in the household, began to recognize the subtle yet undeniable shift. Her attempts to command attention and assert dominance were met with measured acknowledgement from the Duke, yet they failed to unsettle his regard for Margaret. It was a revelation both humiliating and instructive. The constancy of intellect and moral discernment could eclipse the transient allure of beauty and social polish. Eleanor's pride, though bruised, remained intact, tempered by the realization that recognition and respect are earned not merely through display, but through courage, composure, and insight. The culmination of these weeks of measured interaction arrived during a private walk through the estate gardens, under a sky streaked with the first hints of twilight. The air carried the mingled scents of wet earth, blooming roses, and the subtle decay of late spring. They paused by a marble fountain, its water catching the fading light, and the Duke spoke with deliberate clarity. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, eyes meeting hers with unwavering sincerity, "I would not be true to myself, nor to my responsibilities, if I did not acknowledge that my regard rests wholly with you. Your steadiness, your courage, and the clarity of your mind have convinced me that a partnership with you is both right and necessary." Margaret, her heart swelling with emotion she could scarcely articulate, allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, responding with a quiet affirmation of trust and willingness, conscious of the gravity and propriety of the moment. In the days that followed, subtle yet profound changes shaped the household. Sir Reginald, though initially preoccupied with financial calculations and the presumed engagement of Eleanor, began to perceive the sincerity of the Duke's interest in Margaret. His practical nature compelled acknowledgement. The union promised not only emotional fulfillment, but also a partnership grounded in integrity and sound judgment. Margaret, balancing humility with the emerging recognition of her own worth, prepared herself for the evolving expectations of her station, mindful that respect and love must coexist with decorum and discretion. The final weeks before the formal announcement were marked by small, tender rituals, shared walks in the orchard, exchanges of letters filled with deliberate affection, and quiet moments in which the magnitude of mutual regard could be expressed without breach of propriety. Each glance, each brush of the hand, each carefully chosen word became imbued with significance, a testament to the slow, deliberate cultivation of affection and trust. The household, aware of the shifting dynamics yet constrained by social convention, observed with curiosity, restraint, and occasional whisperings that hinted at scandal but never fully breached the veneer of decorum. The day of the formal declaration arrived under a sky of pale gray, sunlight softened by a gentle mist. The Duke, dressed in a coat of deep navy trimmed with subtle silver, arrived at the Whitcombe estate with a measured procession. Margaret, radiant not merely in the elegance of her gown, but in the composure and intelligence that had earned his regard, received him with a curtsying grace tempered by the quiet strength that had distinguished her throughout their acquaintance. Eleanor, ever polished, acknowledged the proceedings with dignity, though her eyes betrayed the faintest glimmer of wounded pride. The announcement, conducted with restraint and propriety, declared the intended union, drawing murmured approval and polite astonishment from the assembled family and guests. As evening settled over the estate, the household bathed in the golden glow of lanterns and candlelight. Margaret and the Duke found a final moment of quiet together in the gardens. The scent of roses and damp earth mingled with the lingering warmth of the day, and in that private sanctuary, free from the scrutiny of society, they allowed themselves the smallest acts of intimacy: a shared glance, a brush of fingers, a quiet acknowledgement of the partnership they would now cultivate. It was a union not of convenience, nor merely of social expectation, but of understanding, respect, and the deliberate recognition of worth. The night embraced them as allies, companions, and partners, poised to navigate the rigid hierarchies and whispered judgments of Regency society together. The estate, finally hushed, reflected the culmination of weeks of anticipation, courage, and careful discernment. Margaret, standing beside the Duke beneath the pale glow of the moon, understood that her worth had been acknowledged not by fashion, beauty, or performance, but by character, intellect, and steadfastness. The Duke, equally assured, recognized that the constancy of her heart and clarity of mind promised a life of shared purpose and enduring affection. And so, as the first stars pierced the velvet sky and the last whispers of society faded into night, the stage was set for a life in which admiration, respect, and genuine partnership would flourish, a romance quietly revolutionary, yet perfectly true to the delicate constraints and enduring virtues of their world.